There's a sound a man makes when he thinks he's watching someone make the dumbest mistake he's ever seen. It's not quite a laugh. It's more of a low, raspy exhale through the nose, the kind that says, "I've been doing this 30 years and I know exactly what that pile of rust is worth, son." Warren Gable made that sound on a frozen November morning in 1982, standing in a gravel lot in Buchanan County, Iowa, watching an 18-year-old kid raise his bare hand and bid $65 on a machine that looked like it had been dead since Truman was president. Warren was a professional, 55 years old, commercial scrap buyer out of Waterloo. He'd spent 2 hours that morning walking that auction line with a ledger in his hand and a cigar in his mouth, buying up broken plows and seized engines by the ton. He knew exactly what cast iron was worth, $22 a ton, going rate, right there in his ledger. That rusted hulk in the back corner of the lot weighed maybe 2 tons. $44, tops. And that was if someone else paid for the diesel to haul it to the smelter. The kid had just paid $65. Warren shook his head, thoroughly amused. Every practical farmer in that yard quietly agreed with him. They were all wrong. Every single one of them. You have to understand what Iowa looked like in the fall of 1982 to understand why a man like Warren Gable would be so certain. The farm crisis had the Midwest in a full grip. Interest rates had gone through the ceiling, land values were collapsing. Family operations that had run for 3 and 4 generations were being liquidated, dozens of them, every week, all across the state. In that kind of economic climate, a machine had exactly one kind of value. Could it start? Could it work? Could it pay for itself? If the answer was no, it wasn't a tractor anymore. It was tonnage. Warren Gable was a master of that math. He'd built a career on it. He didn't care about brand names or history or what something used to be. He walked the lines, he tapped the metal, he ran the numbers, and he made his bids. When he looked at that rusted machine sitting half buried in frozen weeds with its paint completely gone and its exhaust stack wide open to the sky, he saw a 2-cylinder engine block, a cast iron transmission housing, and thick steel wheel lugs. 4,000 pounds of dead iron. The engine was seized, solid pistons rusted to the cylinder walls after sitting outside for the better part of 30 years. Rain and snow had been pouring straight into the manifold since Eisenhower was in office. The fuel tank was rotted through. The wheels were flat steel, sunk into the frozen ground at an angle. Every man in that yard experienced, practical, hard-working men who'd spent their lives around machinery, looked at that machine and saw the same thing Warren saw. The 18-year-old kid saw something else entirely. David Miller wasn't a farmer. He was a high school senior who spent his weekends sweeping floors and organizing shelves at his grandfather's independent equipment repair shop, a small operation that had been running since before David was born. His grandfather had kept everything, every factory service bulletin, every parts catalog, every recall notice that had ever crossed the front counter, going back to the early 1930s. Most people would have thrown that paperwork away decades ago. His grandfather kept it in flat file drawers in the back storeroom, organized by manufacturer and year. David grew up reading that paperwork the way other kids read comic books. He knew machinery the way a card player knows the deck, not just the broad strokes, but the specific, obscure details that don't show up in general conversation. He knew which years had which problems, which early runs had been recalled, which variations had been modified out of existence because of engineering mistakes made in a hurry. And he knew about the 1924 John Deere Model D. The Model D was the machine that made John Deere's modern reputation. Introduced in 1923, it became the backbone of Midwestern farming for decades. But in 1924, the very first production run carried a specific engineering problem that the company moved fast to fix and faster to forget. To balance the heavy 2-cylinder engine, those first machines came with a massive 26-inch cast iron flywheel mounted on the left side of the chassis. On that first batch, the flywheel wasn't solid. It was spoked open arms of cast iron radiating out from the center hub like a wagon wheel, spinning right next to the operator's leg. The engineers figured out quickly that this was a bad idea. A spoked flywheel that size, under the kind of torque required to pull a heavy plow through wet Iowa clay, would develop stress fractures in those spokes. When they let go, they didn't bend. Cast iron doesn't bend, it shatters. Heavy iron shrapnel, moving fast, at leg height. The company issued a factory recall. Dealerships across the country were instructed to pull those spoked flywheels off and replace them with solid cast iron discs. Over the following decades, it got done, almost universally. Parts were scrapped, machines were updated. The original spoked flywheel, 1924 Model D, the Spoker D, collectors had started calling. It became one of the rarest surviving tractors in the country. By the early 1980s, most serious vintage equipment people had accepted that a genuine, unmodified Spoker D in the wild was essentially a ghost. They'd all been recalled into pieces. David Miller knew every word of that history. During the preview hour before the auction started, while Warren Gable was tapping the engine block with a hammer and doing his weight calculations, David walked to the left side of the machine and got down on one knee in the frozen weeds. He didn't look at the engine, didn't bother with the manifold or the fuel tank or the seized pistons. He looked at the flywheel. It was caked in 50 years of mud. Dead vines wrapped around the spokes. A thick, dark crust of rust covered everything. But underneath all of it, underneath the mud and the vines and the frost, there was empty space where solid iron should have been. He counted the spokes. Then he stood up, walked to the auction clerk, and waited. When the bidding opened on that back corner lot, David raised his hand at $65. Warren Gable laughed. The farmers in the yard exchanged glances. $65. Kids going to haul home a 2-ton anchor. David paid in cash. He didn't have a commercial wrecker. He'd borrowed his neighbor's flatbed trailer and brought along a hand-crank come-along winch. It took him and his grandfather 4 hours in the November wind to drag that machine out of the frozen weeds and up onto the trailer. The steel wheels scraped and gouged the loading ramps the whole way up. As they worked, the thick crust of frozen mud started breaking away from the left side of the chassis. Warren Gable had stayed. He was parked by his truck, warm, watching the kids struggle, waiting, probably, for the rusted axle to snap or the cable to slip. But as the mud fell away in chunks, the flywheel came into the gray daylight for the first time in decades. Not a solid disc, 26 inches of radiating cast iron spokes, unbroken, untouched, still wearing the original configuration that the factory had tried for years to erase from existence. Warren stopped smoking his cigar. He didn't know production numbers, didn't know the Spoker D recall by name. But a man who has spent 30 years buying metal for a living develops a gut sense for when something has slipped through his fingers. He walked over slowly and stood next to the machine without saying anything for a while. He'd looked at that flywheel that morning with his professional eye and seen a standard component. He'd been wrong and he knew it. What happened next is where most people would expect the easy ending. Kid finds rare tractor, fixes it up, sells it, collects his reward. Clean story. It didn't go that way. The engine was completely seized, not stiff seized. 50 years of deep rust had fused the pistons to the cylinder walls at a molecular level. You couldn't freeze something like that with a breaker bar in frustration. If David had tried to force it with hydraulic pressure, he would have cracked the original cylinder block, and a cracked original block on a Spoker D would have been an irreplaceable loss. He spent 3 years on it. He poured penetrating oil down the open exhaust stack and let it soak for months at a time. He used blocks of hardwood and a heavy mallet light, rhythmic taps, working around the pistons the way you'd work loose a rusted bolt that you absolutely cannot strip. He let the chemistry do what force couldn't. Month after month, season after season, in his grandfather's shop after school and on weekends, working the engine the way you'd nurse something back rather than drag it back. He also made a decision that a lot of people in his position might not have made. He didn't strip the chassis and paint it, didn't sandblast it down to bare metal and shoot it glossy green and yellow so it looked brand new at a distance. He cleaned it, preserved it, oiled it, but he kept the dark patina of aged iron that had built up over the century. He understood that the tractor's value wasn't in looking like it had just left the factory floor. The value was in the evidence of what it had survived. Every scar was part of the record. You don't erase that. About 5 years after that November auction, Warren Gable came into the repair shop looking to buy scrap radiators. He stopped in the doorway. In the center service bay, idling with the slow, distinctive pop-pop, of a perfectly timed two-cylinder engine sat the machine he'd laughed at for $44. The spoke flywheel was turning. The engine was running clean. Warren walked up to it slowly, stood there listening, looked at David covered in grease, same as always, and was quiet for a moment. "I weighed the iron," he finally said. "You weighed the history." By the early 2000s, a genuine running 1,924 Spoker D was crossing serious auction blocks for over $100,000. The collector market for early American agricultural machinery had gotten deep, and the Spoker D sat at the top of almost every serious list. David Miller never sold his, not for lack of offers. The $65 tractor still sits in the back of the family shop, oiled, timed, ready to run, completely indifferent to what it would bring at auction. Warren Gable was not a stupid man. He was experienced, practical, and very good at what he did. The farmers in that yard were not foolish. They were working people with a realistic grasp of what the early 1980s demanded from a machine. They were all using the right formula for the wrong object. The whole lot of them looked at that rusted hulk and calculated weight. David Miller had spent years in a back storeroom reading 50-year-old service bulletins, and he looked at the same machine and calculated shape. One of those approaches costs you $44 worth of scrap iron. The other one sends you home with a ghost.